Great pleasure to be back at CES, and especially for an event related to Václav Havel, since he mentioned his acquaintance. I would say my first acquaintance with Václav Havel was through a text of his, a letter to Gustav Husák, that I had the privilege of translating into French in the summer of 1975. And that's when I, so to speak, became a Havelite, or I understood that here was somebody who was not, well, let's say, one of your writers protesting simply against imposition of censorship and the loss of freedom in Czechoslovakia, that he was not also a disgruntled politician waiting for his moment, but somebody who was really looking in depth at what was happening to his country, but in a much broader picture. And if one is trying to see today, why is it that he remains such an inspiring figure to people of very different persuasions? This is what strikes me most about him, and perhaps you've noticed in connection with his after his death, the articles in the press, the debates around his, and so in a way, how to account for this? Well, part of it is related to this unique achievement of an intellectual in politics. You know, the traditional opposition of the vita activa and vita contemplativa, the ethics of conviction against the ethics of responsibility, the traditional oppositions that are made. He managed, this is a very unique achievement, to overcome, or at least to be able to live with that tension between the two. Let's say, to live with that tension. I think that is one way of putting it. His, of course, his only predecessor in the Czech context, he's already been mentioned, was Tomáš Masaryk, the first president, but who was also connected to CES. His lecture about the new Europe during World War I, where, in a way, showing the way Europe could be recast after World War I, and you have really a parallel between the two. You have two outsiders, two intellectual dissidents, who even at some point are very marginal on the national scene. Masaryk himself was a marginal figure, you know, in the manuscript battle, in the Hilsner affair, etc., etc. You have a marginal figure who is attacked by the mainstream of national politics, and who, 20 years after, becomes the embodiment of the new state. And in a way, you know, Havel from dissident writer to president, there is no equivalence, and there is also the parallel of them staying in the office for so long. Tim hinted at maybe too long. You know, that is another matter you can discuss. And if I had to immediately give my own, I really had a doubt, and I know that many of my friends in Prague as well, is when he resigned from the Czechoslovak presidency. Should he have gone on to the Czech presidency? That was a big moment, I think, to decide. Should we, know, because when he became president, his initial statement was, this is sacrifice. You know, I'm doing it. I was not groomed to be president. I'm doing it as a sacrifice. Fine. I want to take my country to the first free elections. What a great, you know, achievement for a former dissident. Then you stay on because situation is not yet stabilized. You want to see things through. Fine. Consolidate democracy. That is good. But if you're going for it for a third time, that is to become a Czech president, well, that is no longer sacrifice. That is, you know, you are actually wanting to achieve something, and you believe that the only way to achieve it is by staying in office. And this is where a number of people, had disagreements. They loved the dissidents. They loved the Havel dissident, and they couldn't quite accept the idea that he would become a president, and a president for a long period. There I think is a debate. Is it a loss for the intellectual world that he abandoned his position of a free-floating intellectual, independent intellectual who could have been, addressing the problems of the transition of this country? Or was he more effective in addressing some of the problems of that period by being in office? And in the discussion we can return to that, but I think the crucial moment was that, do you go for being Czech president after being Czechoslovak president? And I think that if one were to look for, among his tremendous achievement, for the one moment where probably he himself felt that the task was beyond him, was the breakup of Czechoslovakia. It's not easy to be president of a state that falls apart. And I remember a conversation with him at that time, and I inadvertently mentioned to him a quote by Churchill. This was after the election, the June election '92, when Klaus, the Czech conservative right, won in Prague, and the nationalist populist Mečiar in Slovakia. And they were pulling in opposite direction, and basically you had then the feeling that it would be very difficult to hold the country together because they were unable to find a constitutional compromise. Anyway, in that context, I remember a conversation when I quoted to him Churchill saying, "I have not been elected to preside over the demise of the British Empire." And I regretted mentioning that quote because I thought, well, okay, this is an encouragement to quit. You don't want to be part of this game. These two powerful Czech and Slovak politicians are pulling in the opposite direction, and you don't want to give them the cover, the institutional cover for something you deeply disagree with. Others, I remember my friend Pavel Tigrik, for instance, strongly resented that. So this is again a debatable issue. But these are the dilemmas you face if you step into politics, and if you become the president, and immediately you will not satisfy not only your political friends, but also you will not satisfy the intellectuals, the writers, and the academics who will always remind you of the principles you defend. Now, back to the question: why is he become a figure that is not only universally known, as I had the occasion to see during recent travels, but also read. And I think the key is that admiring Václav Havel should not dispense from reading him occasionally. And the best, I think Tim already alluded to that, are his essays. And I would say 1975, the letter to Husak, this is a letter sort of in the 18th century sense, this is whatever, 50, 60 page essay about the politics of fear. The essay Tim mentioned, The Power of the Powerless. This is the best known, of course. And a third one, Politics and Conscience, from 1984. I think these three essays, each of them emphasize that they are connected, they are related, of course, but each of them has a strong idea, which I think explains, at least in part, the universal aura or attraction of Havel's political thought. His real contribution as a political thinker. You know him as a writer, as a playwright, you know him as a dissident, you know him as a president, but this is sort of Havel as a political thinker. And these are essays you can read, and they are being read around the world for very different reasons. So the first essay, and I think I must be watching the time, because you will maybe let me know when I have 5 minutes left or something like that. Anyway, in the first essay, the letter to Rousseau, I said this is about the politics of fear, and he explained that this is not the fear I'm speaking of course, to be taken is not to be taken in the ordinary psychological sense as a definite, precise emotion, etc. We are concerned with the fear in a deeper sense, an ethical sense, if you will, namely the more or less conscious participation in the collective awareness of a permanent and ubiquitous danger. And then he develops that idea of what that danger, what that mechanism of fear is, to conclude that we go in various kinds of external adaptation as the only effective method of self-defense. So this is the post-totalitarian system. This is no longer terror. They no longer demand you to believe the ideology. They no longer want permanent mobilization of society for certain goals. They want atomization, withdrawal of society, etc. But everywhere fear is being instilled, and the individual, the government through fear. I think that is the main, and the mechanism are brilliantly described there. The second essay about the power of the powerless, there he defines what this post-totalitarian system is, and I will not repeat what Tim said. I think the key idea there is don't think of totalitarianism simply in the then and after, and there is this group of party apparatchik, the nomenclatura, sitting with their police and their army, and then there is the 15,000 Czechoslovaks who are simply innocent victims. So this idea that each person, that everyone is connected to a different degree. Of course, only somebody like Havel, who went to jail, could write about the idea that everyone is, to some degree, participant in that system. But you realize the implication of that statement, not just for the understanding how the system could work, but also how difficult it is to come to terms with the communist past after it goes. Because if it was simply a matter of denouncing the small gang of usurpateurs who were put in power by Russian tanks, that's a fairly easy proposition. Plus add a few spies that you find on the lists, in the police archives. That's a fairly easy proposition. What Havel describes there makes it very difficult to confront in the period after communism collapses. If you want to understand how difficult it is, you have for 40 years what he described, this involvement of everybody to different degrees. And the third essay that I mentioned, Politics and Conscience, there he has a third idea, which I think is important, is not to see the communist dictatorship as simply an aberration of Oriental despotism. Maybe there are elements of that, of course. This is socialism that came in from the cold, as Sartre wrote in his preface to a book by Antonin Lim. Yes, you have that dimension, but he said this is not the main thing. It should be understood as an extreme version or a pathology of something that exists in Western modern societies, Western civilization. It is, he says, a distorted mirror. He said the greatest mistake the West could make is not to understand that the communist totalitarian system is the distorted mirror of its own, of the crisis of its own civilization. And that, I think, is a very interesting, controversial, very original thought. But if you are asking yourself, well, why is it that students at Harvard, that young academics at Shanghai, or today in Iran or in Egypt, the latest translation of The Power of the Powerless is now being produced in Egypt. In the spring of last year, I had a call from Tunisian intellectuals. They wanted to invite Havel because they said, you know, we read The Power of the Powerless. You know, this is exactly what happened here. You know, he's describing our situation. We really must invite him and talk to him. So you understand what I'm getting at. Everybody can read, and this is the sign of the true originality of his contribution. He's read around the world. He's read in Shanghai. He was read by my students at Harvard, who, when they were reading about government by fear, you know, they thought, oh yes, of course, yes, he's right, absolutely. This is what we have, you know, since Bush, the War on Terror, Patriot Act, or whatever. I'm not saying that they're reading it correctly. I'm simply saying everybody in their own situation, in China, in Egypt, or wherever, they are reading this text and projecting on it and finding it useful, interesting, powerful to understand their own situation. And that, I think, is a sign of a truly original work, where through the experience, analysis of Central European, East European totalitarianism, he arrives at something that is truly universal. And that accounts, I think, for his contribution as a political thinker. Now, then there are the questions of what happened to the legacies of dissent, since we are emphasizing particularly that legacy. Maybe in the discussion we will, or the ambassador will surely talk more about the presidency. But if we are talking about the legacies of dissent, well, you know, many people say, you know, great ideas he had for resisting totalitarianism, but they proved ineffective or irrelevant after, in the building of liberal democracy. Those ideas, this sort of insistence on the absolute ethical categories, and all his themes were understandable in that context, but perhaps not so relevant. And if you want to see what happened to his political friends, well, you see how much they got in the elections. They got 4.9% in the 92 election. So one way of saying is, you know, great legacy, but not very relevant. You know, well, okay, I'm maybe making a shortcut by saying his friends, but many of his friends, with Dienstbier, Palos, Longlist, Bidhart, they were all on the civic movement. And I apologize if the ambassador thinks I'm doing something, I'm saying, and then making too much of a shortcut. But in any case, there is no Havel party. There was no Havel party in Czechoslovakia or Czech politics, and many people say, well, you know, great contribution, great ideas, but, you know, they didn't really materialize in Czech politics. Now, if you look at today's situation and you see 20 years after, what is the debate about the state of the country and the state of Czech democracy? Well, you find that the first of Havel's themes, that is, you cannot have politics without ethical foundation, that this is something that Living in Truth was the dissident version of it. But of course, the connection of ethics and politics was his founding principle. Well, this is precisely what has been most missing. Okay, this is precisely what has been most missing in the period that followed. If you look at the state of corruption, the cynicism, etc., this is clearly has something to do with one part of Havel's legacy that has been, let's say, ignored, or that is being rediscovered by people who are now discussing these issues. Second, about democracy, the state of democracy. Yes, of course, democracy is there, functions, there are elections, no parties, etc. But if you look at every opinion poll, you see the huge distrust in the political system, in the political elites, in the political parties, etc. And Havel's argument was, that has something to do with the second idea of dissent, which is that you cannot rediscover democratic politics without the idea of civil society. And therefore, that idea that has been again ignored or forgotten after 1989, is being rediscovered by a number of people saying, well, main problem is that the political sphere is living in isolation from civil society and democracy suffers. And the third idea of Havel's in the dissident days was thinking about Europe, overcoming the partition of Europe, engaging in dialogue with West Europeans, even people he disagreed with, such as pacifists, etc. And that is the third issue on which there is today a debate, a controversy in his country as well. So, yes, he hasn't left the party of the president, he hasn't left the Havelite party, but the Havelite constituency, just like his international readers that I mentioned, is a very broad one, very diffused one, and this is the legacy people refer to when they are questioning or challenging the state of their country's politics today, 20 years after the fall of communism.